Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming. This is like a nice, feels like some kind of family gathering. I'm Megan Hoyer. I'm the Director of Public Programs and Public Engagement here at the Whitney. And I'm going to just start with this quote because I can't really think of anything else to, because it's summing up, I think, a lot of what we're all feeling this week. So David Wojnarowicz once said, quote, "I see that there's a certain amount of information that's totally ignored in this country, that all of this is built on blood," end quote. I want to also, with this quote, take the opportunity to both recognize this condition and make a gesture towards change, and acknowledge that we are here tonight on unceded indigenous lands, specifically the territory of the Lenape. Tonight's program is organized in conjunction with David Wojnarowicz, History Keeps Me Awake at Night, the brilliant, necessary, and all too timely exhibition upstairs on the 5th floor. And I hope you have all seen it already at least once. The show closes on Sunday, and the galleries are open tonight until 10 p.m., so please head upstairs after the program if you have time. And I want to, again, thank all the thanks to David Breslin and David Keel, co-curators of the exhibition, for making this incredible show that it's been a real privilege to work on. It's fitting that we are marking the end of the exhibition here at the Whitney with tonight's conversation with 4 artists who belong loosely to a generation that was just coming into consciousness during Wojnarowicz's moment in the late 80s and early 90s. David Breslin and I are also roughly in this cohort, and we found ourselves asking a lot of questions about what it means to look at David Wojnarowicz's work today in 2018, as well as to engage with the aesthetics and politics of his moment. Questions like, what's useful now and what needs to be let go of? What is the value of a certain kind of nostalgia and what is dangerous about it? What histories and artists have been left out or erased, and how does attending to them shift our understanding of where we are now? These are questions I think that are also at the heart of Wojnarowicz's practice, which is always grappling with history. We borrowed our title for tonight's program, Forever in Transition, from something he wrote in Close to the Knives, which touches on his approach. And so I'm going to quote him again. "Transition is always a relief. Destination means death to me. If I could figure out a way to remain forever in transition, in the disconnected and unfamiliar, I could remain in a state of perpetual freedom." So I'm going to briefly introduce our speakers tonight, and then turn things over to David Breslin, who I'll also officially introduce as the Martini Family Curator and Director of the collection here at the Whitney. So Ken Okiishi is an artist based in New York. His works hover over and within the relationships between matter and memory, perception and action, image networks, and media systems. A.K. Burns is an interdisciplinary artist and educator whose work explores the body as a contentious domain wherein socio-political conditions are negotiated. Using video, installation, sculpture, drawing, and collaboration, Burns queries systems of value as they are embodied at the nexus of language and materiality. Rooney lives and works in New York City. Her work encompasses photography, sculpture, video, and writing, often using sculptural forms and materials to encase or frame photographs. Its subject varies from documentation of her community, especially through dedication, her environment, and the passage of time as seen on bodies and film. Tiona Nekkia McClodden is an interdisciplinary artist and curator whose work explores and critiques issues at the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, and social commentary. McClodden's approach traverses documentary film, experimental video, sculpture, and sound installations to explore themes of rememory and narrative biomythography. Please join me in welcoming them all to the stage.
Good evening, everyone. I'm David Breslin. I wanted to start first by thanking Megan Hoyer. She does, like she does with all of her programs, a brilliant job of helping us frame how we can think about the extension of the exhibitions that we do and also kind of make them in some ways more than can happen within the frame of a gallery itself. I also, in the kind of idea of acknowledgement, want to thank all of the art workers, artists, health workers who have done the work to permit an exhibition like this to happen, but also to thank all of you who create different publics for a future life for Wojnarowicz and the ideas in an exhibition like this that hopefully extend beyond that. Megan and I and David Keel, great co-curator of this exhibition, have heard a lot of talk about people saying it's a very apt show, it's a very timely show. And sometimes I think, what does that mean? I want to hear other people speak kind of more to a particular word about this. So these four great artists and people have kindly agreed to think with us about David Wojnarowicz's work, questions of timeliness, what belongs, what doesn't, what we want to hold on to, and what things might be useful to shed, as Megan discussed. So the framework of this evening is that each participant is going to do, however they choose to do, a reflection on Wojnarowicz, his work, or that time in reference to their own work. And Megan and I gave them no cues, and it's really hopefully an opening to think through that. So we'll do that, and then have a brief conversation among ourselves, and then have time for questions among all of us. I wanted to read a short passage by David Wojnarowicz from an essay that he wrote in honor of his friend Montana, who committed suicide around the time that he was reckoning with his own illness, because I think it's timely now, speaks to different generational issues, and also ideas about a future. So if you'll forgive me for doing this first, to kind of summon Wojnarowicz before we kind of begin part of this. Why does this one die and that one not? What does all this mean? How do I map all of this down? I respect just about every attempt at survival I witness these days, but every person will eventually lose his struggle just as I will one day, and that makes each attempt more filled with life. That means sadness at the loss, but more sweetness in the attempts. That means maybe fewer hours on the face of this disorderly planet, but less shit I'll have to deal with. And anyway, here I am in the back seat of this taxi cab, waiting for the light to turn green so that I can arrive at my home, because I feel too sick to walk or wait for a bus. And isn't it lovely, this pattern of sunlight drifting through the side window across the back of my hand, laying at rest on my thigh? Isn't it beautiful, the fact that I can see this light? One day I won't. One day you won't either. Sometimes I watch the leaders of this country on television and think, at least nature, quote unquote, will reach where assassins are unable to tread. Maybe they'll die of massive coronaries from all their cannibal banquets, or maybe brain tumors from the radiation in their environment. Education is and will always be a generational thing, and because of that, I lose hope sometimes in the idea that the shape of what we have to live in might change. I have always viewed my friends as checkpoints in a series of motions of resistance to the flood of hyenas in state or religious drag. If we all die off, what will happen to those we leave behind who are just this moment being born? I realize that Cretans have roamed and will always roam this planet, whether I am here or not. There's one born every minute. This is a jarring drift. This perspective makes my heart and soul sway. I want relief from this tired yapping of my brain. I wish I could pluck it out and throw it into the corner where it can chatter away while I go out for the evening. So I'm going to stop yapping and chattering and pass it along to Ken to begin.
Okay. So, hello, everyone. I'm showing a video that I shot in fall of 1999 in 2 locations. One location was the last gasps of the sex cruising piers outside this window behind us that's covered up by the screen, that were in the process of becoming the city park athletic activity and family-friendly tourism zone that they are now. And the other location was outside the back door of the Cock, just outside the cruising area of that gay bar when it was on 12th Street and Avenue A. And also across the street from my apartment, my fire escape looked out onto this back door and the Chico mural that was also there, which I think has been painted over. The David Wojnarowicz retrospective at the New Museum, when it was on Broadway, had also recently closed. So here we are, fall 1999.
I'm looking for the Piers, man. You mean Chelsea Piers? Sports near King Complex? The Piers, man. I'm looking for the Piers. Yeah, this is the right place. This is Chelsea Piers Sports near King Complex. I've been working the streets for about 15 years now. Yeah, since I was like 4, like around then. And yeah, I mean, I've had a really great time. I mean, like, it's gotten to the point now that I'm 19. I really enjoy getting my ass fucked on like a nightly basis. Like, even if the cocks are really thick and huge and long, I mean, like, a part of me really enjoys it. I mean, I get fucked in the ass, like, about 3 times a night, but, it's okay, it's not bad. I'm a Lacanian also, so, I can sort of enjoy, the realm of my father. I went to Curfew one night, which is the hot gay teenage dance party. And being a hot gay teenager, that's like sort of where I like to go, where I like to hang out. And so one night, I went there and I met this cute kid. He was like a ballet dancer or whatever. And so, whatever. I told him that I would go back to his place and suck his cock, for like a small fee. He was cute, so I didn't charge him that much. And a few days later, I came down with gonorrhea in the throat, which was really traumatic for me.
down on my knees and I can't focus on anything. I have no time to understand the position of my body or the direction of my face. I see it paralyzing rough corduroy, and the color of the pants is brown and surrounded by dark shadows. And there's a sense of other people here, and yet I can't hear them breathe or their feet move or anything. His hand suddenly comes up against the back of my head, and he's got his fingers locked in my hair, and he's showing my face forward and twisting my head, almost gentle but very violent. Behind the gentleness, I have got half a breath in my lungs and the smell of a kiss on the floorboards and this heavy bulging in his pants getting harder and harder as his face is forced against the front of his pants, the zipper tearing my lips. I feel him getting fat and bruised, and all the while he's stroking my face and tightening his fingers around the locks of my hair. And I can't focus my eyes, and my head's being pushed and pulled and twisted and caressed. And it's as if I got no hands. I know I got hands. I had hands a half hour ago. I remember lighting a cigarette with them, and I remember how warm the flame of the match was when I lifted it towards his face. And my knees are hurting real bad from the stone floor, hurting because they banged on the floor when he dragged me down the cellar stairs. I remember a door in the darkness and the breath of his dog as it licked at my hands when I reached out to stop his head. When I reached out to stop my head, long descent, its tongue licking at my fingers and my face slammed down, and there's this electric gland inside my head, and it's like my eyes suddenly opened on one huge bright sun, and then went black with the switch thrown down, and I'm shocked, and there's pressure on my face.
I was at the meat rack one night, and I was just there. It was like one of my nights off, so I wasn't like, fucking for money or whatever, but I was there to get some action, and I met this really hot trainee there who, God, it was beautiful. Her name was Justine Bates, and I was like, God, you're just so fucking beautiful. And so we were in the meat rack or whatever, and we started to make out, it's like in the woods, it's late at night, and so she lifted up her skirt, and I started to go down on her, and I was expecting to get a really hot piece of trainee cock in my mouth, but then she lifted up her skirt, and there was nothing there. It was just this wet abomination, this deep sinking hole. But being, a Lacanian, I was able to accept that because I wanted to explore that lack, that, the cunt being a signifier of the universal lack. And so I stuck my tongue deep within her, and so then I went up and I started to kiss her, sort of, and, I stuck my hot cock that everyone wants a piece of, deep inside of her, and she started to moan and everything, and then she went down on me, and she was, sucking my hot tenderloin for a while, and it was really good, and so then I shot this, really thick, hot load of soy milk into her mouth, which she really appreciated, being a vegan and all. And so we went back to her place. She owned a condo in Fire Island, and we just watched The Sound of Music and made out in the dark. It was very romantic, and yeah. But I haven't found Justine since then. And so here I am, back on the streets, selling my ass for $25 a pop. So I don't know what left there is for me to do, except for maybe, I don't know.
Hello. Thanks, Ken. Okay, I've got a blank screen here. There we go. So I'm going to talk about a piece that I created, finished this summer. It was a commission by the Harvard Museum in relation to a photo-based show that they were curating that had a number of works of artists like Peter Hujar and Nan Goldin and David Wojnarowicz, a certain generation of photography. And the museum has a top floor exhibition space, which is a glassed-in room with 9 monitors set up in a grid. And so they commissioned me to put something in this grid of monitors in response to David Wojnarowicz. And I had a yes-no feeling about it, which was I'm totally not interested in this 9-channel grid situation you want me to work in, but I'm totally interested in thinking about David and his life and his practice. So I took it on, and one of the first things I did was they invited me to go into the archive and actually look at all the works that were going to be in the exhibition. So I went to this very sterile room and put on white gloves and had the pleasure of getting to look through and touch art in that way that we don't get to very often. And I was really struck with kind of a huge amount of sadness in that process because I was looking at David's work and Peter's work and a lot of other people's work at the same time, but looking at David's work and which is so viscerally speaking about the lack of care and the lack of social and political infrastructure for dealing with marginalized bodies, and yet there was this sort of irony of the amount of care that was being put into his body of work. And so I was kind of struck by this kind of how we care sort of on a larger social political sphere for our bodies, and then how we care for this the body of work, the value systems that shift, and the kind of resources, the allocation of resources that go into that, and even the notion. And then I, of course, it was a funnel of things that kind of came through, and then it was this also feeling that how the value system of a work shifts post-mortem, typically, and that so there's some increased value in one's death, or the inability to survive, and so I was just like, oh God, what do I have to do with this, kind of very raw feelings about kind of working with inside an institution and trying to examine. This is all I could think about kind of examining or working through with this work. What was I going to say? Maybe I'll just forward. This is actually a still from the video work, and I'll just say that I started kind of just collecting video over the course of a year while I was working on this piece and trying to figure out how to deal with this kind of weighty emotional thing I'd gotten myself into. And I was in Marfa because my partner, Catherine Hubbard, was doing work down there. And we went to this neighbor, so we're in Juddland, and we're in this self-made museum. Also this, which kind of got me also on this tangent of course, the discrepancies in values of artists who are capable of accruing value within their lifetime, and then how they also can, the ability to like create your own museum for yourself, or this kind of, that disparity as well. Anyway, so this was in a neighboring town. I just sort of love this display case that was in front of the graveyard. It seemed apt, so it found its way into the video. This is a really awkward installation shot. Apologies for the skewed angles, but so this is kind of the space. I should have gotten a full room shot of this space that I was asked to work in, but this is the 9-channel screens that I was asked to work with, and then if you turn around in this room, it's a glass room. It's glass on the other 3 sides. And it's on the top floor of the Harvard Museum, and it happens to actually look out into the conservation labs. So this was also another double sort of set of meanings that I found myself in, which is that this space I would be exhibiting in was looking directly into the conservation labs, which is the thing that I had kind of gotten triggered by originally in thinking about the work. So I asked them if they'd let me into the labs to shoot the labs and kind of, so I could have footage that was clearly kind of reflecting on the site in which the viewers were going to be situated. What else do I need to tell you about it? The other thing that happened is I was very frustrated with the being given a kind of fixed format to work with. It's just not, I tend to be very particular about the kind of, I'll just say I don't believe in just exhibiting video like on a wall, or I guess I think about scale, and a kind of physical presence of a video is like pretty important to me. So I wasn't really satisfied with working with the prefab situation that was there, and so I kept being like, can I just pop these off the wall? Like, I just kept poking at them, and they're like, no, don't take them off. You know, the institution was just like, don't move them. So I had this like long push and pull with them about needing to disrupt this surface somehow. And through this like kind of game of jostling them, I actually came to this kind of, I think, which for me turned out into be a really beautiful solution, which is they wouldn't take anything off the wall if it wasn't protected, and I had like stanchions around it and this whole thing, and I was like, oh my God, like, so I was like, okay, we're gonna put it, you know, in a crate. It'll be as safe as it can possibly be, and then that crate is gonna be like basically our coffin in the room, you know? And so anyway, so that's just to sort of describe how you see this video. One of the channels is sort of displaced, as you can see, into the crate. And this is just an image of the crate. And the video itself is a conglomerate of footage I shot, like on my iPhone and stuff, just around, and then just stuff I collected over the year, like when I was in Marfa or other places. And then stuff I've pulled off the internet in terms of found footage, and then there was a whole series of stuff that I shot actually at Harvard in the labs. And this is not a very useful scene here, but there was also kind of, I started also working with kind of the degradation of the image as another form of kind of representing the kind of integrity of the visual space. Anyways, so I'm gonna, oh my goodness, can I, okay, hold on. Okay, as soon as I do that, it's gonna play it. So let me just preface, I have 2 short clips. This is like a 20-minute work, and I'm only showing like 2.5-minute clips, and they're kind of related, and they're kind of from the early middle part of the video. So one is really concentrated on the visuals, the visual scape of the lab, and I also asked for a tour. I don't know how many of you have been to the Harvard Museum, but they have this incredible pigment collection, which is like, it's kind of the origin of paint and pigments that are used for everything from dyes to paint. And, or, you know, and I was like, can you please give me a tour of can I get a toxicity tour? That's basically what I asked for. So what we're gonna see is an excerpt where I've kind of cut together some of those interviews around in the interviews in the pigment collection with the lab itself. And then the second section I'm going to show you is where I've pulled David's reading his own texts in with images of the lab, and then some excerpt of him speaking. And just to note, like, the whole thing kind of has a wider breadth where Audre Lorde shows up and Judd shows up, and like there's a kind of way that it's a collage of various, looking at value systems that are going on for different types of bodies and different relationships to the institution. Okay, that's a very long-winded intro. Okay, here we go. Oh, one last thing, I'm sorry. Really, I swear. I just want to also say that the incredible soundtrack you're hearing is by Jill Stimbroni, okay? Thank you.
The paintings and sort of as well, kind of all of the treatments we have that are really complicated are definitely collaborative efforts. And then also with the scientists as well.
This Chinese Vermillion, it's a mercuric sulfide pigment. So it has mercury in it, which obviously is no good to anybody. It starts off as a very bright orange color, but on exposure to UV light, it changes and it becomes darkened. So often on early Italian paintings, what you'll find is that there'll be a saint which has orange drapery, but the highlights are painted what looks like black, but that's because they were very bright orange and they darkened over time. This is a pigment that I believe was used as makeup at some point in the past, and again, you wonder why people would put this stuff on them, because the toxic properties of mercury, which is a neurotoxin, actually are very well documented. We have here is lead white, and this was the predominant white pigment that was used up until the mid-19th century. And it's a pigment that's made from lead, so you get lead metal, you then put it in a sealed container, suspend it over vinegar, and then cover it all with dung. And
that's a little abrupt, but and then I just want to note that when you're seeing inserted screens, that you have to imagine that you're. Oh, sorry, guys. I just want to note that when you're seeing inserted screens, you have to, of course, imagine that it's on a 9-panel grid, and anything that's in the bottom right corner is actually occurring within the coffin / art handling case.
When I put my hands on your body, on your flesh, I feel the history of that body. Not just the beginning of its forming in a distant lake, but all the way beyond its ending. I feel the warmth and texture, and simultaneously I see the flesh unwrap from the layers of fat and disappear. I see the fat disappear from the muscle. I see the muscle disappear myself in the bones. I see the organs gradually fade into transparency, leaving a gleaming skeleton, gleaming like ivory, that slowly revolves until it becomes dust. I'm consumed in the sense of your weight, the way your flesh occupies momentary space, the fullness of it beneath my palms. I'm amazed at how perfectly your body fits to the curves of my hands. If I could attach our blood vessels so that we could become each other, I would. If I could attach our blood vessels in order to anchor you to the earth, to this present time, to me I would. If I could open your body and slip up inside your skin, and look out your eyes and forever have my lips fused with yours, I would.
And here I am, I'm making, a gesture, to deal with these people and what they've done, and suddenly what I've done is despicable or terrible enough to have funding lifted. And I said, do you understand what it is to have AIDS in this country, to turn on the TV or open the newspaper and see these people and see them legislate, things so that I'm invisible, that I have no voice, and that my image is suddenly non-existent, and that nothing, no gesture I can make could even approximate the violence of what these people have done.
I'm going to end it there. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, AK.
So this is on, okay. Thanks, Ken. Thanks, AK. Those were both so beautiful. I'm going to show some slides, and some of them are David's work, some of them are other people's work, and some of them are mine. And so just for the sake of being orderly, I labeled them. The ones that are mine don't have a name. The ones that are not mine have a name. And that is all I'll say about that. The image that sat with me for years after seeing a fire in my belly were the ants crawling on the cross and the bread being sewn shut. The body of Christ is evoked, and the after image lingers. Moments later, we see a strobe-lit, erect penis being masturbated. The juxtaposition is gratifying. How are we supposed to separate the horrors of the life of Christ and the rituals around its memorial from the material, even grotesque and abject stuff of life? Drink my blood, eat my body. The back-breaking dragging of the cross, the heat of the day, the scratching and scraping of the thorns on the scalp, the puncture wounds and draining fluids, the grief and devastation, the way of sorrows. What really can a child do with these images? For me as a kid, my anger with the church was uncomplicated. I saw it as a house of cards whose shining symbols, rich colors, recesses, and textures only had meaning outside of the church. They became politicized when they entered the real world and collided with real bodies, our forms confronting their forms. I thought my priest was despicable, which he was later proven to be. The church that had excommunicated my mother made me feel shame, no totemic meal for her, as did my queerness. But somehow I never blamed the church for that, nor did I ever confess to it. As an adult, the rage I feel towards the church is immense and much more complex than it was when I was attending Mass every Sunday. The violence of the Catholic Church is responsible for bringing onto its people is immense and countless. made all that much more violent by ruining itself, self-immolating, at times when people need houses for faith immensely. This is true of David's time as it is now. That there may be a God or may have been a God in all of this is another thought. God for me, and I think for David, was exterior to the church. The church's fallacies and its violence are that of the pre-invented world David spoke of, not of love, not of honesty, not of extraterrestrial bliss. Somewhere in the first room of the exhibition, I wrote down in my journal the iconography of crisis and vulnerability. And I think of Botticelli's sinewy Saint Sebastian. Yukio Mishima, the writer who treated his ailing health with a grueling physical regimen, became a samurai. One muscle, one word, presenting quite the opposite of vulnerability. And I think of Peter Hujar dreaming of Mishima masturbating to the saint. As a child of the woods, like me, David seemed to find God in the animals he played with, cared about, and kept. The flowers he painted, actually all living things represented, pointed towards the government's culpability in our humanitarian and planetary crisis. Within and outside of the AIDS epidemic, David's work radiates fear and longing. What will we do if all this goes up in flames? Is the opposite of the pre-invented world the inside of your lover's anus? God is love, love is God. It's really Jules who reintroduced me to the possibility of a genuine spirituality at a time when I realized being out had opened up space in my heart for it. Love is love is love is love. I was 18. David talks about a similar sense of freeness around accepting his sexuality. He writes about the way the world opened up for him. When I took my students through the show and we sat on the steps in front of the Whitney and reflected on David's anger, I asked them, what do we have to be so angry about? We talked about a short story of his we'd read in class, a blowjob on a train platform, and how much love David had radiated towards his fleeting sex partner despite the mounting violence of the situation. And there are other stories like this in his writing, where it's not so much his actions, but his feelings and his expression of them that extend love outwards, like charity, almost religiously, like acts of hope. I think about the house on fire and all that it can and does mean, and I cannot help but think of it as a church. James Baldwin gives a beautiful address to a group of college students, I think, in 1960, about the artist's struggle for integrity. The role of artists, as he sees it, is very similar to David Wojnarowicz's strike against the pre-invented world. Poets, Baldwin says, are the only people who know the truth about us. The government doesn't, the priests don't. It's our responsibility, he says, to use whatever has hurt us, is hurting us, to connect with the pain of everyone else who is alive. And because so many others are unwilling to shine light on that pain, we become outsiders and the church stops praying for us. And this is paraphrased, but he continues, we're at the edge of a field. We see the house, and it is warm, and the lights are on. It's glowing, and we're cold. We approach the house, and they are waiting for us. They want to let us in, so we go in, but eventually it's intolerable. The ones in the house see that you are aware, and they cannot bear it. The idea that as a very young child, we're expected to traverse the church's perimeter, moving our small bodies along a path that might in some way mirror the path Christ walked to his death is perverse. Were Christianity's grip on culture not so dominant, so infused with exclusion, violence, and control, testing a child's willingness to confront death might be holistic. If like life is a cycle, to be a child is to be in the midst, or even at a critical juncture of that cycle. I might cry, scream, throw myself on the velvety floors of the church in response to these injustices. I remember seeing Philadelphia with Tom Hanks and Denzel Washington as a 10-year-old and crying so hard I dry heaved, the way a child would in response to atrocities they cannot comprehend. The church, the absent and judging father, always registered falsely to me, AIDS though I knew was real. The idea of what is real and what is not real sits heavy with all of us. Peter's feet are David's pieta. As we collectively wonder whose hands will build us back up and whose are responsible for putting us down, we have to grapple with the role images and representation play in our understanding of our spiritual, and that is to say, not pre-invented life. Thank you, Anne.
Transition is always a relief. Destination means death to me. If I could figure out a way to remain forever in transition in the disconnected and unfamiliar, I could remain in a state of perpetual freedom. This quote frames this actual convening. And in thinking about what it means to be in transition, it led me to a youthful time in my life when I ran track, and I wasn't great at it at all. But what I liked about track, and especially where I landed within shot put and disc after failing to be a good runner, was that it is both an individual and team sport. You can compete within your field and have the opportunity to win for yourself while also racking up points that could allow for the team to win. I've always admired the runners who did the 4x1 relay because of the baton passing. The skill of it, as well as the risk involved, the formation of the race, this led me to the idea of the baton as a body of work. And I wanted to use that in a way to link some of the folks and the formations that I want to bring to the forefront in regards to my relationship to them within the last 4.5 years of my own artistic production. In these years, I specifically have focused on 3 Black gay men who produced work in the 80s in the face of the AIDS epidemic. I was prompted to really dig into that time primarily because I was having a very hard time producing my own work about 4 years ago. This was 2014. Eric Garner is killed in July, Michael Brown in August, Tamir Rice in November, and so on. Death and Black bodies were everywhere, and I was having a very hard time regarding what it actually meant to even be an artist in this moment, what it meant to produce work in the face of death. I chose to continue to work by exploring artists who produced work in the face of death and fear. I decided to focus on the 80s. In 4 years, I produced individual bodies of works for poet Essex Hemphill, composer and pianist Julius Eastman, and writer Brant Johnson. For me, these artists chose to live, not merely survive as people and as artists. They took risks and they were vulnerable. I was born in '81. And even though that isn't exactly the year of the discovery of HIV or AIDS, as earlier cases precede the CDC's formal public acknowledgement, every year that I celebrate my birthday, there is a public-facing anniversary that coincides with AIDS that has also grown up with me. One that I've always been very aware of since the age of 13 due to my own relationship to the South, where there was an actual project housing development in Greenville, South Carolina, where I was raised that was quarantined due to numerous positives that were found amongst the women, men, and children who lived there. This was in the mid-90s. Then there was the time spent in the new attitude a black gay club in Greenville that I snuck off to as early as 15 years old. The Attitude is where I became close to elders who eventually died from AIDS-related complications. They also showed me and my friends picture albums filled with their friends and elders who also passed. I wanted to start off by acknowledging Joseph Beam, a writer who I have not produced work on, but is crucial in talking about in this first formation. Joseph Beam is important to the two men I have produced work in honor of. My relationship to Joseph Beam, especially with his book, In the Life, a Black Gay Anthology published in 1986, is special to me as I had read it early on at Clark Atlanta University before I dropped out. Beam's anthology gave me not only insight on the spectrum of black gay men, but also insight on what it meant to actually live with AIDS. Joseph Beam dies in Philadelphia in 1988 from AIDS-related complications. In 2013, my friend and archivist, Stephen Fullwood, publishes an anthology, Black Gay Genius, answering Joseph Beam's call, which features a few men who were also featured in Beam's earlier book. Joseph Beam brought me to Essex Hemphill because Beam also had published Essex in his anthology, In the Life, and when Beam passes, Essex moves in with his mother, Dorothy Beam, at her request after she asks him to finish her son's book. Essex finishes Brother to Brother in 1991. Essex dies in Philadelphia in 1995 from AIDS-related complications. On December 1st, 2015, I premiere an online work that I created for Essex Hemphill on the occasion of the 20th year of his passing. A fixing ceremony, 4 movements for Essex. I take up his question, one that is posed during one of the last public presentations that he gives before his passing, one that considers how his body and identities will be experienced in cyberspace. I answer with his body of work the things his friends and loved ones have kept of him. Brad Johnson, a writer on the periphery of Hemphill and Beam, serves a full term in the U.S. Navy in 1981 as an out gay man and comes straight to Philadelphia, walks into Giovanni's Rooms bookstore, where he meets Joseph Beam, who is working there at the time. Joseph Beam publishes Brad's work in the Life. Brad also reviews Essex's first larger publication, Earth Life, with a rigorously detailed 2-page review in the 1986 summer issue of Blackout. The editor is Joseph Beam. Brad writes on subjugation in 1981, the year I was born, while enlisted on his naval ship, the USS Nassau. It is published in other countries' Black Gay Voices in 1988. In 2017, I read this poem while suspended upside down by my feet in an attempt to render myself in a complete jouissance. These are 3 artistic relationships that were forged over time, in life, and in death, and these are my posthumous mentors, my guides. I attended Skowhegan this past summer and have a studio visit with collector Bernard Lumpkin, who after a brief chat about my prior work asked me if I know of Alvin Baltrop. I had never heard of Alvin prior to this. When I look him up, I see the peers and realize that I have seen his work before through the documentation of another artist, Gordon Matta Clark. Baltrop's documentation of Gordon Matta Clark's Day's End is so special because it captures, as it was, simply just there as a part of the architecture. I think that it's interesting to think about location and space and how Baltrop's documentation of Matta Clark's work also allows his archive to have an extended life posthumously. This brings me to yet another David Hammonds, who has extended the baton of legacy in his recent public art proposal, Days End 2018, a skeleton structure of the architecture of Pier 52 that would be mounted in the exact area as the original pier. Gallery 8 in the exhibition for David Wojnarowicz by both Davids, there's so many Davids, it's something special, is where this all hits me. I like to think that all of these things sit on top of each other, collapsing into a beautiful moment. David W. is reading from his text, and I sat in the room invoking a vicarious nostalgia that I do not own but has evolved in parallel to my life as a Black queer woman. In regards to an exhibition, these are the moments that I look for. It is a perfect formation. These formations for me, or transfigurations, that take shape after these people have passed, is for me the way that I have received the work. In thinking of how we can process ideas of using not only timelines and place as a uniting factor, but how we can think about the periphery. People who are on the periphery who are documenting, but also people who have allowed for a certain kind of publication or redistribution of another artist's practice in life and death so that they can have a rightful honoring. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiona. And thanks to each of you for those fantastic presentations and reconsiderings of your own work in relationship to this exhibition. I wanted to start maybe with your great presentation that ended them, and this, I think, really interesting distinction that you make between living and surviving. Because I think that so many of the works that have been touched on have this idea of care, lineage, bringing forward. And could you talk a little bit about what that means to you? Because the text that I started with by David W. talks a lot about surviving, and that's a very ingrained temporal moment for him to be talking about that. Could you talk a little bit about that distinction for you?
It's just for me specifically, I think the way that I've thought about living versus surviving it just really comes from a saying that a lot of elders have told me, that like, you don't want to just survive, you want to live, right? We did all this work because we don't want you to just try to survive, we want you to live. And I think that what happens is, especially being in archival spaces, you come up against the narratives that people have, like, I think, synthesized on behalf of people that talk a lot about their survival and their positionality as survivors, and what it meant to survive in the space, which suggests a certain kind of oppression or something that they're resisting against or fighting up against, or, you know, trying to thrive in these ways. But in particular with these men that I was focusing on, and a lot of the figures that I try to focus on within my work, I think a lot about living, and I tend to go towards those artists that challenge those ideas or disrupt those things. And so I think in those spaces of finding someone who is thinking about living, they don't exactly follow or stand in the molds that people have presented for them. They're a little wilder. They're taking more risks. They're thinking very much of the moment. And I was very interested in what that looked like, because that was very much what I wanted to do, but was having a very hard time doing. I found myself in a coping mechanism of survival, and I just really wanted to live. And I was trying to figure out how to reconcile those feelings and produce work that would suggest that, you know, so that, you know, I think people coming after me would see that I lived. Yeah.
Is there something of that in your work? You know, the story that you tell of your students outside on the stairs, you know, in close proximity to so much of the stuff that Wojnarowicz is writing about, but also from the vantage point of your own work that's thinking about the place of religion now that it's not so much different than the church then in Wojnarowicz's time. So unfortunately, we heard too much about survivors within the context of the church and sexuality, and your work seems to want to ingrain a kind of an ongoingness to an idea of spirit that's separate from that. Is that something that you see in Wojnarowicz's work? Is that something that you see as something that you took from it but had to make anew?
Is it something I see in it that I took from it, but that I had to make anew? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I feel like the way that I respond to the use of religious symbols and even spirituality it's actually kind of hard to separate myself from it in my own sort of thinking about how I've used those symbols and those signs, and even some of those ideas in my own work, like thinking about looking at artists of the 80s and the sort of punk ethos of, like, you know, sticking it to the man, and if the man is like God or your priest or your teacher, that like there's something about that, and not to oversimplify it, but that I see in the work, not that I don't think David is genuinely grappling with these symbols and didn't genuinely have violent experiences in Catholic school and with the church and beyond. But that, like, I sort of see the two things as being really separate. On the one hand, there's this fuck you to the church, and then on the other hand, there's, well, what about like my spirituality and me owning my own spirituality, and what is spiritual, and like living is spiritual, and loving is spiritual, and connections are spiritual, and that's just like everything. That's just like the stuff of life. So I really respond to those two things being in proximity to each other in the exhibition, and I do sometimes play with that in my own work. The church was like the first place that gave me good things to look at, basically. But I don't necessarily see them as fused.
AK, the kind of issue of lineage in your work, I think, is really interesting, and obviously interesting in all of the work that was presented tonight. But this idea of kind of care obviously also brings to fore that these people who weren't cared for are no longer here. And I wonder if, in this idea of kind of a perpetuation of care, asking why care wasn't, do you ask questions? Like, are there what if questions in your work? What if David Wojnarowicz was here, Peter Hujar, obviously Nan Golden is here? I mean, in some ways, that lab is a place of wanting to project a future onto things. And a lot of that work in particular is about the impossibility of a future. So I wonder, how do you think of lineage and kind of gaps in that lineage? Tiona speaks very interestingly about this idea of the mentors who are no longer here, the predeceased mentors. Do you think of it that way?
Yeah, I think that, you know, there's always this question of like, I think it's particular for our generation somehow that there is a sense of nostalgia for the AIDS era or something, because I guess there's a sense that there was a lot of energy that coalesced in crisis, and that somehow we missed out on something. And it's like nostalgia, I think, is a really kind of terrible way to think about it, because there's nothing to desire about everyone around you dying. But and then there's this kind of aspect of like, okay, because I'm close with people who are of that generation, right, and who survived in various ways through that, and you can talk to them about it, and you can hear about that loss, and you can hear about that time, and there's some kind of narrative lineage that gets passed on, it's kind of clear how that affects a particular generation, and even the output of art that comes from a certain generation. But I have so many questions for kind of our generation in terms of, and especially because it affected such a high percentage of queer artists, that, you know, who would we know, who would we be having conversations with, who, like, I feel like I would have known David, right? Like, he's close enough in friends to people I now know, or that these are people who I would be having a conversation with, and who their their presence would be as important to me as the other people who I know from that generation. And so that I think we're missing, we're kind of like, there's a loss for that generation, but there's a loss in our generation in terms of whatever that mentor structure that I think is kind of natural generationally. There's a big void there. Okay. But then I'm like, then the complexity of getting into something that's like kind of critical or critiquing the archive specifically, but also, you know, it's like, I'm incredibly thankful that his work is preserved, or any number of artists' works is preserved, and that the institutions do take on that responsibility. And therefore I can have some access to this thing that is a void, essentially, or and so, yeah, I don't know, I'm kind of rambling, but I think in the work I was trying to not, it wasn't meant to be like institutions are bad and you know, in that sense, but more like, it's just, for me, the questions I want to ask are just like, what are we doing with our resources, and why can't we do both things? Why can't we care for the body when it's living, and why can't we care for the body when it's past? Yeah. You know, it just seems like why is that so hard? Anyways, I don't know if that actually answered your question, but I think it was.
Yeah, I'm glad you got a lot of that out there too, because I think that's something that, in working on this show, I think one of the great things that was able to occur was to meet people that Wojnarowicz worked with. Obviously, there are people who we can't talk to because they're no longer alive, but the number of people who in the course of doing research, or like in your work, you know, James Wency, who made all of that great footage of the ACT UP meetings and the political funerals, and Phil Zwickler, who recorded a lot of Wojnarowicz at the time of the Witnesses exhibition. These other ways into a body of work, and the idea of so much of the work that's done by you, but also in the show by Wojnarowicz, is in community and in collaboration by people we know and some people that we don't know, or some people we can't know. And Ken, in your work, there's both this like great humor. I was 4 years old when I started hitting the street, but also like a real kind of tenderness towards one subject who really wants to find what's lost. And I wonder if that kind of dichotomy is at play. This like idea of there's such hyperbole around a memory or a fixation on a nostalgia, and then kind of a desire for it, or a desire for a form of it.
Yeah, I think my perspective might be less holy and more heretical than other people. Because really, in making the piece and kind of over the years researching what was, you know, what was happening, but then also acting these things out and what happened. And actually, I should say, the dialogue that Travis Jeppesen, he was a student at the New School, I was a student at Cooper when I made this. He improvised the dialogue, so I didn't write that. But what am I trying to say? I think that it's like, for me, and this is gonna sound horrible, but why not? It's of course there is all this kind of reverence for elders and all this kind of stuff, and I understand that. But my relationship to that entire discourse is really more one of like questioning and rejection and kind of you know, is this connection between violence and sex and sexuality and a kind of gay patriarchy really something that needs to be kept so holy? Is that really such a great thing? And that, for me, that's what the humor and the rupture and all of these kinds of things do. But then on the other hand, it does aren't these forces the same forces that are related to to not understanding how certain parts of urban experience and life and zones of activity should all go towards the same kind of family, heterosexual family structures of safety and playgrounds where you like bounce off the floor and zones where you're supposed to be very athletically fit and like a place. I think that for me the most telling aspect of all of this is that the Chelsea Piers place is a big fashion studio. I mean that's where you go to fashion shows. That's where they kind of market both styling and kind of anxiety levels of self-presentation that make you want to spend, $1,200 on a jeans jacket. I just think that that's interesting that the same kind of zone that's depicted with so much nostalgia is also the zone that is now producing that nostalgia as something you have to buy.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, Ken, not to put you on the spot, but do you think that this then perpetuates the same kind of rehearsal of certain people that keep on having certain kinds of exposure where other people's don't? There's a certain kind of then romance around certain figures that kind of eclipses the...
Oh, yeah, that was the thing. That was what happened after the Wojnarowicz retrospective at the New Museum at the time. And I was lucky enough to be studying with people who lived through that period, but with a very different perspective. Mm-hmm. And they found the kind of hagiography not just disturbing, but in relationship to the rapid, this is going to sound strange because this is 20 years ago, basically, but the rapid gentrification of the East Village in the late 90s, and the kind of what was seen as a destruction of urban experience and possibilities of certain subjectivities even having the option of appearing. Mm-hmm. That the hagiography was just weird in that context. Mm-hmm.
Does anyone want to say anything about that idea of hagiography? Because I think in some ways I really agree. In another case, there are certain figures that, Em and I spoke a little bit about this on the phone when preparing for this conversation. We don't get so tied up about other certain figures that, say Warhol, who has a show coming up next, who questions ideas of hagiography. But I don't know if we would, in some ways, pressure on it so much. So do we need to have a certain kind of, is it a kind of a counter hagiography? Do we consider this as an opening? Does Wojnarowicz or other figures like him that are part of a discourse of outsiders, should we have a hagiography of them to build upon? Not that it should be some kind of hero worship, but a possibility for other heroes that can be put out there. I don't know.
Can I say something really explosive just for fun?
Do it.
I mean, isn't there, I have found recently in American political discourse that there is a reliance on some other kind of person to fix everything for everyone else, right? And the way otherness has been defined is bizarre to me as someone who grew up in the 80s and 90s, where ideas of marginality and self and other were not attached to, just like Judge Kavanaugh or whatever. Like, they were not just, these Yale white bodies, right? And now all of a sudden it's all these others who are supposed to fix everything, and I think that's just weird. It strikes me as so weird that I can't even understand it.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there has to also be an acknowledgement that not everybody's things are kept as well as David's have been kept, which allows for that hagiography to even exist, right? I mean, the people that I mentioned, especially the folks that I've produced work on, they don't have archives. Brad does have an archive. It's very small, 6 boxes at the Schomburg. Essex doesn't have an archive. His books are out of print. Julius Eastman just got a publishing deal posthumously. The first one that he's ever had didn't have an archive, We just went and tagged things so that they can make it searchable. So I think that while I don't feel any way compelled to try to fix things that aren't made for me. I'm very much interested in tending to references that I was robbed from, right? People that I wish I was in conversation with or I could have researched. You know, I think one of the things that I thought about, especially over this last 4.5 years, was what it meant to go seek out someone that, you know, kind of exists as a myth and give them a body first. And then whoever wants to do the hagiography stuff can do that, like, when I'm 60. And so that's what I feel like I've kind of been dealing with, like, bodies, you know, like trying to put people together and see what is left to kind of get an idea. But also to, like, leave space for the fragility of, like, memory around them and incorporating that and letting that be something that can exist as biomythography, which is what I'm more invested in, more so than, you know, hagiographies. I think that I resist any kind of, like, you know, very, like, white patriarchal, you know, positioning of, like, certain kind of bodies of work or faces for something that is affecting so many people that look like me. And it's like, I think it's very complicated. So I don't, you know, I think I agree very much with what you're saying about people who are expected to fix things. But I also am very interested in the people who feel compelled to try to fix people who could be a part of their lineage.
Yeah, I was gonna say that I think for me, the thing with David, and not just David, but also Hujar and Paul Tech, when his retrospective, I guess, was at the old Whitney, is that there's this, like, the hagiography comes up, and this is really sad, and I'm just, like, processing this in real time, that I think because I personally had so few women mentors, I can't think of like a professor that I've ever had that fills that role. Or, I mean, there have been amazing artists that I've worked for and people that are, like, older than me that are artists that I am so grateful for. Thank God finally that they exist, that are women and queer people. But all of my mentors and everything that I was taught for my entire educational life was basically, like, men, and straight men mostly also. And so for me, there was something, and still is something, in this work that it opens the door slightly ajar outside of the trajectory, the canon that I was taught to. And honestly, you know, if this is accurate to say, and it's complicated and probably wrong, but, like, feminizes it or something, or opens it up to a different perspective that I'm still grateful for, despite what you're saying, which I think is really true and good.
Well, it's getting close to 8, and I want to make sure that we have time for AK. If we have time for questions from anyone here.
Hi, good evening. I'm glad I showed up. I'm a self-taught artist, and I came to know David through a gay hookup site. Could you believe it? I met this guy in there. I told him I was an artist, and I said I was self-taught. And he said, "Oh, you're like David." And I was like, "David who?" He's like, "Oh, go to the Google his name." And I went to the Whitney website, and then visual aids, where I'm an artist member, because I've been living with AIDS for 18 years now, and I'm gonna be 41 in December, and realized that him and I shared some similarities: self-taught photographer, mixed media, and stuff like that. The only different distinction is like this beautiful young lady who was talking about, I'm a boy of color, I'm a brown boy. And we're all really talking about legacy here, right? And stuff like that. And I started thinking about that a few years ago, what I want my legacy to be, and building my own legacy and archive, and start putting that together. And I started that by mentoring. And I said, how would I do that? And I would give a short story. When I first came to America, I'm from Belize, Central America. Our teacher took us to the ballet, and I said, that's what I want to be. And he sent a letter home to my parents saying, get me to a ballet school, a scholarship. And my father was homophobic, and he says, he's a faggot, you're a sissy, you act like a sissy. 2 days later, I was taken out of his class, and he was no longer supposed to have contact with me. So when I became an artist, and I was asked to go mentor to a school in my neighborhood in Washington Heights, this young man walked up to me after I read my 13-year-old voice from my journals in high school to the class to connect with them, and told me I was in foster home, group home abuse, and everything. And that they might be going through that, but it's possible. He came up to me and said, can I have your card? And I've been mentoring him since he was 15. He's now 20. He just recently turned 20. He's in college. So I'm really proud of that. That's my greatest achievement. Not Agnes Gunn, who collected my work about 10 years ago, or Bruce Bastian, but he's my greatest accomplishment. And that's like my legacy, like, because I'm changing the narrative that happened to me as a child, where a gay man can mentor a straight child, you know? And he later on mentored some other kids. So he was passing the baton along as the relay race someone mentioned there. You know, so that's how I look at my legacy going forward too, not just in my body of work, who maybe someone like you would revisit me in 20 years after I'm gone, you know, come back to my work and revisit me and come back to my notes and archives and stuff like that I'm preparing already to hopefully have it so someone like you can go to it and show it. Because our voices are missing. As you can see in this room alone, my face is missing, her face is missing. Our voices and our stories I just told you are missing. You know, institutions don't give us a standing voice. So I just thank you for giving me a standing voice at this moment. I appreciate it. And thank you for giving me faces to look at, an inspiration.
Thank you for your contribution. Any other questions? Comments? If not, I just want to thank our great panelists very much, and thank you for sharing, thank you for your contribution, and please, I invite you to go see the show. It's open until 10 o'clock tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.